So let's take a few more moments to renew, refresh our positive motivation for being here. And at the Abbey, Sravasti Abbey, where I live, we generate a motivation every morning to do 3 things during the day. Those 3 things are to help others as much as we can, and secondly, to not harm anyone as much as possible. And third is to work for enlightenment, to dedicate the things that we do for our future attainment of enlightenment, Buddhahood, to be able to help all living beings in the best way possible. So if that resonates with you, if that sounds like something you'd like to do, then you can generate that motivation to benefit, to not harm, and to dedicate everything for enlightenment. But feel free to use your own thoughts and words, your own ideas, to generate a positive altruistic motivation as your reason for being here. Okay. So last night we had a brief introduction to the Lamrim, an overview of the Lamrim. I hope it wasn't too overwhelming for you if you're new to the Lamrim. But I will continue talking about the points I raised last night, and hopefully it will become more clear. So the Lamrim is not really intended for beginners, for people who are brand new to Buddhism, like most of us when we start. Most of us are not raised in a Buddhist family, in a Buddhist environment, and we encounter Buddhism partway through our life, some in their teens, some in their 20s or 30s or 40s or 50s or 60s, some rather late in life. But prior to encountering Buddhism, we've had a lot of other education and experiences and so on and so forth. And then we encounter Buddhism, we start learning about the Buddha and his life, his teachings, and so on. So we come to Buddhism usually with a mind that's pretty full of a lot of other things. Not an empty, like a blank slate, not completely empty. And so, a lot of the Buddhist ideas are quite new to us and also quite challenging, because they often clash with things we have already learned and experiences we've had and so forth. I think that in the 60s and 70s, when Westerners started encountering Tibetan lamas in places like India and Nepal, so Tibet was taken over by China starting in about 1950. Things just got worse and worse over the years, and then in 1959, there was a kind of mass exodus of Tibetans. The Dalai Lama fled. His life was in danger. Many other Tibetans also fled in Tibet, including a lot of lamas, teachers, and they had to go by foot over the Himalayas, like the highest mountains in the world, and sometimes and often in the winter when it was just so much snow and freezing cold. So they really had a hard journey to get out of Tibet. And then they settled in different areas of India, Nepal, Bhutan, and so on. Those areas. And around that time, there was this exodus of Western hippies, mostly hippies from that era, going to India and Nepal. Some were in search of spiritual teachers and spiritual teachings, spiritual experiences. Also, drugs. That was part of it too. So there was some meetings, encounters between these Western hippies and Tibetan lamas, and some of the Westerners would ask for teachings. You know, they wanted to learn about Buddhism, and two of the lamas that were most interested in teaching Buddhism to Westerners were Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa Rinpoche, who were the founders of the FPMT, Foundation for the Preservation of the Mahayana Tradition, which is the organization that Maitreya Instituut is part of. So this all started in the late 60s and early 70s, initially at Kopan Monastery in Nepal. and so for the Westerners who were interested in learning Buddhism, the lamas started teaching the Lamrim. And like I said last night, at that time there was almost nothing available in English about Buddhism, about the Lamrim. There were other Westerners who went to Dharamsala in northwest India, where the Dalai Lama was living, and and they started studying there at the Tibetan library, and that's where I first started learning Buddhism, the Tibetan library in Dharamsala. And again, what was being taught was mainly the Lamrim. And I think at that time, I know myself, I didn't really think about it very much. I thought, okay, the Lamrim, this is a really good way to learn Buddhism because it kind of explains the whole path to enlightenment in a step-by-step way and in a fairly clear and practical way as well. But it was only after quite a few years that I started thinking that actually the Lamrim isn't really for beginners. It's really for people who already have quite a good understanding of Buddhist ideas, and not just an understanding, but an acceptance, belief, faith in Buddhist ideas. Because if you look at the topics of the Lamrim, one of the very first topic of meditation is what's sometimes called guru devotion, but that is not an accurate translation of the Tibetan. The Tibetan actually says reliance on a spiritual teacher or a spiritual mentor. Some prefer the term mentor. Reliance on a spiritual mentor. But in that topic, you're taught like how to search for a teacher, what qualities to look for, and then when you do find a suitable teacher, how to devote yourself to your teacher. And the kind of essence of that is you have to see your teacher as a Buddha. So this is the very first topic that we meditate on in the Lamrim. And if you think about it, Westerners coming from the West and not knowing much or anything about Buddhism, and then we're told, okay, you have to find a teacher and see your teacher as a Buddha. But, we don't really know who Buddha is and, why we should believe in Buddha and his teachings, and why do we even need a teacher, and seeing the teacher as Buddha and so on. So, our minds are not really ready for that topic. It makes a lot more sense that we first learn about the Buddha and his teachings, like who he was, what his qualities were, what he taught, and then spend time thinking about his teachings, deciding whether or not this is something right for us, something we want to follow. And that's what the Buddha himself said. He said, don't just blindly believe my teachings, but investigate them, check them for yourselves to see if this is what you believe or not, if this is true or not. And only then should we follow his teachings. And so, having gone through that process of learning about, thinking about, and deciding, this is what I want to do, this is what I want to practice, I want to live in my life, only then is it suitable to then have a teacher and rely on a spiritual teacher. And then the second topic in the Lamrim is called the precious human rebirth, precious human life. And that's, contains a lot of different material, including the whole idea of rebirth. The whole idea of the precious human life is that, we've had many lives before this one, and in our previous lives we weren't always born as human beings, but we were sometimes in other realms of existence, like animals. And then there's also hungry ghosts and hell beings. So in our past lives, we were sometimes in those other realms, born in those forms. And in this life, we're human beings. And this is actually really fortunate, because as human beings, we have an intelligent mind that can understand the Dharma, practice it, and we have other conditions in our life as well, enabling us to practice, healthy body, healthy mind, enough food to eat, and basic necessities, basic resources, and so on. We have access to teachers. So there's all these sort of conditions we have in our life that make our life really ideal for engaging in the practice of Dharma. So it's actually a beautiful topic. It's very, very helpful, especially for people like myself. I had a very negative view of life and myself, and it really helped me to just turn my mind around and feel, oh wow, I'm really fortunate and I want to use my life well. But that idea is within this whole Buddhist worldview that takes, talks about rebirth and beginningless mind and also future lives. And the way it's presented is like, this is just how it is. It's just assumed that you already believe in rebirth, reincarnation, different realms of existence, and the possibility of us human beings being born in these other realms. So these ideas for many of us are like, what? This is actually one of a very difficult topic for many Westerners, the whole idea of rebirth. We're not brought up with it. Yeah, it's not part of our upbringing, part of our education, part of our culture and society and so on. And instead, many people are brought up with a more materialistic view, like, based on science and the whole idea of the brain being the source of all our experiences, and then once we die, our brain dies, then that's it. There's nothing left, nothing that continues. So a lot of people have that kind of view, and then it's very difficult, very challenging to accept that there is something that continues to exist after death. For those of us who are brought up in a religion like Christianity, it's maybe less difficult because we have a similar idea of a soul that continues to exist after death. But a lot of Westerners who are brought up in Christianity or Judaism reject those religions and everything they teach. So anyway, the idea of rebirth or reincarnation and other realms of existence is very challenging for a lot of Westerners. But again, the way it's presented in the Lamrim is like, this is how it is. And of course, you believe this. Everybody believes this. It's just the way it is. You don't question it. So just for those first two topics in the traditional presentation of the Lamrim, there are things that are not really suitable for beginners. And it seems that His Holiness the Dalai Lama understood this quite early on, because he had a lot of meetings with Western people, including scientists and educators and so on. And he kind of quickly realized that we needed a different approach. And so he, for many years now, he has said that the way to teach Buddhism to Western people, or anyone who's coming from a non-Buddhist background, is to teach the Four Noble Truths, the Buddha's first teaching, and also the two truths, which are relative truth and ultimate truth, conventional truth and ultimate truth. Now that topic is very difficult, but a lot of people can get some idea about it, that there's this relative level of things that we live on, in our everyday life, but then there's another kind of reality, another level of truth or reality, how things exist, that isn't what we normally experience. So there are these two levels of truth or reality. And so that's his recommendation for teaching Buddhism to Western people. And so back in the 90s, in the mid-90s, Venerable Thupten Chodron, who taught here earlier this year, I think April, maybe she came here in April. Some of you may have attended her course. So she and I started studying Buddhism around the same time. I've known her since the mid-70s. And she went to see the Dalai Lama in the mid-90s and asked if he could compose a Lamrim text that's more contemporary, that fits the contemporary situation in the world. And also, taking into account what's going on in the world and Western science and other religions and so on. And so as a result of that meeting, he actually gave her some work to do. He said, he gave her a lot of teachings that he had given that had been transcribed, and he asked her to sort of put those together. And then also he asked her to include material from other Buddhist traditions, because he wanted people who follow Tibetan Buddhism to understand the other traditions of Buddhism, particularly what he calls the Pali tradition. That's like Theravada Buddhism, mainly practiced in Southeast Asia, and also the Chinese tradition, which is also Mahayana, like Tibetan Buddhism, but they have some different approaches in that tradition. So that began this big project, which culminated in the Library of Wisdom and Compassion. And this is actually like an encyclopedia. It's like 10 volumes it's kind of a modern, contemporary Lamrim. It contains most of the traditional Lamrim topics, plus some additional material you don't normally find in traditional Lamrims. And so it goes from, the earliest things. And actually the first volume is, I think it's called Approaching the Buddhist Path. So it's more like a pre-Lamrim. It's talking about some basic ideas of Buddhism, and also things that related to questions people often have about science and the mind and the brain and so on. So it's mainly the Dalai Lama's teachings, the Dalai Lama's own words, edited by Venerable Chodron, and he asked her to be actually co-author, so some sections were actually written by her. She also brought in material from the Theravada tradition. She spent time in Thailand studying that, and also the Chinese tradition. She has a lot of contacts in Taiwan, Chinese teachers. So I just wanted to mention those ideas because if you are new to the Lamrim and you find some of the ideas challenging, it's completely normal. It's completely natural that you do. And and then also for those who are more have studied the Lamrim before, and maybe you don't know about this series of books, I really want to recommend it. It's fantastic. I don't know, do you have it in the library here? You have it, yeah. It's really wonderful. It's really fantastic. And I was kind of fortunate. She asked me to read each of the volumes. Well, not all of them, but starting with volume 3, just to check, if there's any errors. And so I got to read the manuscripts before they were published. So I got to read all of them. And it's just fantastic. Really, really wonderful. So for those who are serious students of Lamrim, I recommend those books. And here's just one quote from the Dalai Lama, something that he said when they started working together on this series of books. He says, "The Lamrim assumes that someone is already a practitioner with full faith in the Buddha. The main audience for the Lamrim texts in all the Tibetan traditions is someone who already has some knowledge of rebirth and karma, the 3 jewels, reliable cognizers. That means valid cognizers. This is, again, another topic I'll mention later. And their objects, meaning Buddhist epistemology, and so on. We need to add introductory material to this series so the students are properly prepared." Yeah, so he is confirming that the Lamrim is not really for brand new beginners. It's not like a ABC of Buddhism, introduction to Buddhism. And I've also, once I was attending some teachings that he was giving, and I heard him say that the intended audience of the Lamrim are those who have already studied the great treatises. And the great treatises refer to texts that the lamas, well, monks and nuns, study in their monastic universities. So Tibetan monasteries, at least in the Gelugpa tradition, are really more like universities. Of course, they they take vows, they keep vows, and live a monastic life, but they're mainly studying. And they have a curriculum that goes through some of the main texts from India, what the Dalai Lama calls the Nalanda tradition. Nalanda was a monastery in India, where, again, the monks would study these treatises and also debate. They would debate them to, sharpen their intelligence, learn to think critically and question things. And like the Buddha said, we shouldn't just believe, but we should check for ourselves. So debate was a way to do that, a way to, check if things are true or not, if you really know what you're talking about, or if you're confused and deluded. So they use that in the Tibetan monasteries. So they have classes where they get teachings from their teacher, and then they get together with their fellow students and debate. And they spend a lot of time debating, and they say it's really, really helpful to check what you understand and don't understand. So anyway, what I heard the Dalai Lama say was that the Lamrim is really it's like a practice manual. That's what he said. He said it's a practice manual for those who have already studied the great treatises. In other words, those who have gone through that series of teachings. And that can sometimes take at least 15 years or more like 20 years. So it's really like PhD work, right? We have, we usually have about 12 years of pre-university work, and then we have university work, and then we have post-grad work. And so, when you come out of that education system, then you have a Geshe degree, like Geshe Sonam Gyaltsen, so he's been through that. So you're really knowledgeable about Buddha's philosophy, Buddha's teachings. And so the Dalai Lama said the Lamrim is a practice manual, like, okay, now you know Buddhism very well, you know the path to enlightenment very well, so this is how you practice it. Yeah. So when I heard him say that, I thought, yeah, that makes sense, that Lamrim is not meant for brand new beginners who haven't really learned Buddhist philosophy. Although we can still find a lot of value and benefit in learning the Lamrim and meditating on it. I think people like myself who started like that certainly did find a lot of benefit. But on the other hand, there's often a lot of areas that we find very challenging, because rebirth and relying on a spiritual teacher, karma, and so on. So we often have doubts about that, about such topics. And also another thing, most of the lamas had no idea about our background, like where we come from. No understand. I mean, Tibet was really isolated. They didn't have much contact with the rest of the world. They had no electricity, so of course they had no telephones or radios or those kind of things, TVs. So they were just in their own world. And so most of them had no idea about our religions, like Christianity and Judaism, about science, and so on. So they didn't really understand where we were coming from, what kind of things were going on in our minds. And that, could lead to certain problems as well. Like, just an example is, a lot of Western people have certain emotional tendencies, like feeling guilty and being self-critical, having low self-esteem, even hating ourselves. Yeah, so many of us have those tendencies. And then when we listen to certain teachings, for example, about karma, we hear about bad karma, all the different kinds of bad karma there are, and we realize, oh, I've done that, and I've done that, and and also about delusions or afflictions, greed, hatred, ignorance, and we can see those in ourselves. And this will, this kind of teaching will trigger our guilt and our self-criticalness and our self-hatred. And so we're sitting there, hating ourselves, beating ourselves up, feeling absolutely horrible. And some lamas even really emphasize those topics again and again and again. It's like, oh, we're beating ourselves up. And so there's one story of a conference that happened sometime in the early 90s, where there was some Western teachers, Buddhist teachers. Some of them were also psychologists, and they were meeting with His Holiness the Dalai Lama and some other lamas, and they were just discussing this whole process of bringing Buddhism into the West. And one of the teachers, I think it was Sharon Salzberg, who has written books about loving kindness and compassion and so on. She said that when teaching loving kindness meditation to Western people, you need to teach them to love themselves. Because normally the way that meditation is explained is you just love everybody else. You send loving kindness to all the people, all the beings, and so on, but no mention of yourself. And so she said, but we have to teach Western people to have love for themselves as well, because so many do not have love for themselves and even hate themselves. So the Dalai Lama was listening to this, and apparently he was like puzzled by what she was saying, and like he didn't understand. And then he had some talk with his translator, I think it was Thupten Jimbo, and they talked back and forth for a while, and they finally got it, and he was like, what? You mean there are people who hate themselves? Like it was a totally new idea to him. And then he asked the people in the room, how many of you have this problem? Almost everybody put up their hand. And some of these people were therapists, they're psychologists. So that's the story that I heard. And so that was his first exposure to this problem of self-hatred that many, many of us suffer from. And so since that time, he often, especially when he's teaching in the West, he will talk about how important it is to have love for yourself and compassion for yourself. And, if you don't love yourself, you can't really love others. And so he's picked up on that, and some other Tibetan teachers have as well. But if you just look at the traditional teachings, the way they came from Tibet, there's no mention of loving yourself or having compassion for yourself. And there's even a lot of talk about the faults of being selfish or self-centered. And that can almost sound like you're not supposed to love yourself. You're not supposed to care for yourself. You're supposed to disregard yourself, put yourself down. It can sound like that. And so those kind of teachings, if you already have the tendency to hate yourself and beat yourself up, those will just increase that tendency, in the name of Dharma, in the name of the path to enlightenment. So it's clear that there needs to be some adjustments made in the way that the traditional teachings of Tibetan Buddhism are taught in the West. Because in Tibet, they had the Dharma for about 1,200 years. And wherever Buddha's teachings go, whatever country they go to, they kind of get a little bit altered according to the people, their society, their culture, their needs. So each group of people will make some adjustments. And so, the Buddhism we get from Tibetan teachers is suitable for Tibetan people, but not necessarily for us. We're different. Lama Yeshe understood that early on, and he said, you need to make Western Buddhism. Do things, that are suitable for Western people. So things are changing. That is happening. So like the example that I mentioned of the need to teach people to have compassion and love for themselves. So that's very much needed by a lot of people in the West. And also emphasizing the need to investigate and check the teachings, not have blind faith. Because Tibetans generally have amazing devotion. Whatever you tell them, they believe it. If it comes from a lama, they will say, yes, it's true. They don't have any question. And the Dalai Lama is, in recent years, he's telling them, don't be like that. You need to be 21st century Buddhist, meaning you need to check, investigate, be scientific. And so he's very much aware of needs of the present time, present world and situation and so on. So I just wanted to mention that because it isn't always mentioned especially if you're getting teachings from Tibetan lamas. They don't all necessarily understand this. Some have, especially those who have been teaching in the West for a long time. They understand the need to make some changes, some adjustments when they're teaching to Western people. But then if you're reading traditional Lamrim books, like those by Lama Tsongkhapa or Pabongka Rinpoche, they're completely within the Tibetan worldview, Tibetan culture, Tibetan society, not really considering other kinds of people with different cultural backgrounds, different religious backgrounds, and so on. So then there's sometimes a little tension there in understanding these teachings and how to apply them to oneself. Does that make sense, what I'm saying? Yeah. Okay. So let's see, we have until 11. We have, this session is until 11, then we have a break. So if you could put the slide, there's one slide related to what I want to talk about this morning. It should be slide number 6, and it's about the initial level or small scope. So I thought to go into that this morning. Okay, so last night I mentioned that the Lamrim consists of many different topics, and these are divided into 3 sections, known as 3 levels or 3 scopes: initial, intermediate, and advanced. So this first of the 3 scopes, known as the initial level or small scope, is essentially about developing concern for the future, not just this life, but future lives. And probably the majority of people in the world are not thinking much, unless they're religious. Religious people will be thinking about what comes after this life. For example, Christians, or most theistic religions, they have the belief in afterlife, and there's a soul that will go on after we die, and if we've been a good person, then there's heaven. If we've been bad, there's hell. So that's kind of the general idea. So they do have concern for that, and they try to live their life in a good way, being a good person, and being generous, being faithful, and so on, so that they will go to heaven after death and not to hell. So some people in the world are thinking about the future, but a lot of people are not, especially in this day and age in Western society. How many people do you know that are concerned about after this life? So I think, a lot of people, maybe the majority of people, aren't thinking about that at all. They're only thinking about this life and being, surviving, paying the bills, taking care of yourself and your family, and having fun as much as you can, trying to avoid problems as much as you can. So basically focused on this life and not really thinking about, the whole idea, the whole topic of death is often a taboo subject, right? People don't want to hear about it or talk about it or think about it, right? Let's just not go there. Let's avoid that. And that has changed over the last maybe 40, 50 years with people like Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who kind of brought death out of the closet into the open, and others as well. And so, the whole hospice movement, taking care of people's physical, not just their physical needs, but their emotional and spiritual needs as they are approaching the end of life. So there's a lot more awareness of that, and people working with that, like you're working with hospice, people dying and so on. Yeah, and there's a lot of books and material and films and so on. So it is more out in the open than it was in the past. But still, for a lot of people, probably some people maybe your parents, grandparents, they just don't want to talk about that. Too much fear, too much anxiety. But anyway, in Buddhism, the Buddha's approach is we have to think about it. We have to accept that we're going to die, and then live our life with that awareness that our life is going to end, and that doesn't mean the end of us in the sense that our mind, our consciousness, we don't have the word soul. We don't talk about soul in Buddhism, but we do talk about our mind, our consciousness, that is something that continues after death. And for those who are relatively new to Buddhism, the mind this is actually quite a complex topic. There's a whole study, a whole course you can take to learn about the mind. What is it, the different types of mind? Because mind isn't just one thing, but it's actually more like a stream, a continuum made up of many different individual experiences of different types. We have different types of mental states or mental experiences, and each of these arises and passes, arises and passes. Yeah, so mind is constantly changing, a constantly changing stream that's made up of different kinds of experiences. And some of these experiences are thoughts, lots of thoughts, and but also perceptions like seeing, hearing, smelling, and so on. So those are also part of our mind. And then there's memories from the past, fantasies about the future, and all our emotions, many different kinds of emotions like sadness and happiness and anger and fear and anxiety and so on. So those are all part of the mind. So there's many different types of mind, and each of these experiences, like I say, it arises, it lasts a very brief moment, and then it disappears. But there's another one happening immediately, And so it can look like something sort of solid and unchanging, but in reality, when you pay very close attention to your experiences, you can start to see how it is changing all the time. And so, according to Buddhism, mind is, it's not the brain, it's not any part of our body, it's not anything physical. It's totally non-material, non-physical. So that means it's, it's not made of particles, matter. So it can't be seen under a microscope. It can't be seen by any instruments that scientists have so far produced. So they can't, their instruments are unable to detect the mind. They can observe activity in the brain. They can see, things happening in the brain, and they can, by that they can know somebody's thinking, or somebody's feeling angry, or somebody's dreaming. I haven't really studied much about the brain, but we can see things happening in the brain. But that doesn't mean the brain is the mind, and it also doesn't mean that the brain produces the mind. Now, this is still an area that's being kind of explored and discussed. Scientists and lamas like the Dalai Lama are sharing information and discussing, what is the relationship between the mind and the brain. But I've heard the Dalai Lama say that, because in Buddhism, well, especially Tibetan Buddhism, we talk about different levels of the mind, and there's the coarse level of the mind, and that includes our thoughts, like all of our thoughts, and also our emotions and our perceptions. So those are on the coarse level, like the surface level of the mind. But then there's also subtler levels of the mind, down to the most subtle level of the mind, which is called clear light, the clear light mind. And that is the part of the mind that actually leaves, when we die, it leaves our body and goes to the next life and takes another rebirth. It's that very subtle level of the mind. And so the Dalai Lama has said, and in discussion with scientists, he says that when it comes to the coarse level of the mind, like our thoughts, our emotions, and so on, that is clearly related to the brain, but the subtle level of the mind is not. That is something independent of the brain, not related to, not dependent of the brain. But like I say, this is not an area that I'm very knowledgeable about, but there are people looking into this and discussing this. But anyway, the way I like to think of it, this is a really simplistic maybe idea, but the brain is like the hardware and the mind is like the software. So we have our computers, our devices, and if you don't have software, if you don't have apps and software and so on, there's nothing you can do, right? You can't use your computer or your phone. So you need this software for it to actually operate. So I think maybe, the brain is like that. The brain is like the hardware, and then the mind is like the software, the actual intelligence and experiences that are happening kind of within the brain or related to the brain, but not the same as the brain. But anyway, from the Buddhist point of view, the mind is something separate from the brain, and when our body dies, our brain stops functioning. The mind continues to exist, and it separates from the body, leaves the body, and then goes and takes another life, another rebirth. And so from that point of view, it's really important to know about the mind and take care of the mind. Meaning we try to keep our mind positive as much as we can, not let it get taken over by negative states like anger and hatred, greed, self-centeredness, ego, and so on. So try to reduce those aspects of the mind and increase the positive aspects of the mind, like compassion and love, caring for others, wanting to help others, not wanting to harm them, and so on. So doing our best to live our life in that way. So in that way, our mind will be in a good state most of our life. And then when we come to the end of our life, they say that the way we live determines the way we die. Yeah. So if we live a good life, try to be a good person, keep our mind positive as much as possible, we'll be in a good state of mind at the time of death. There's lots of cases of that, stories about that, cases of that. Maybe you've had that experience yourself. And then if the mind is in a good state when we die, then the next life, next rebirth will be a good one, a positive one. On the other hand, if we don't take care of our mind and our mind gets taken over by negative states, anger, hatred, greed, jealousy, and then we act out those negative states of mind, we do harmful things, and just take care of ourselves and not take care of others, and anyway, create bad karma. Then at the time of death, it's more likely that the mind will be in a negative state, not a good state. And then the next life will reflect that, will be in a bad situation. So this is the essential idea in the initial scope, is to come to that conclusion. So the topics of the initial scope is first we become concerned about our future lives by meditating on, first of all, impermanence and death. Impermanence meaning it's like just the nature of things, that they change. They don't stay the same, they change. And that includes our body, as is obvious, although we often don't like to think about it, but our body is getting older all the time. In fact, in Buddhism, it's said that aging starts the second moment after we're born. You're born, and then from the next moment you start aging. It becomes more obvious when you're in your 40s and 50s and so on, but it's a process that starts right from birth, that our body is getting older, and it gets older and older and older and older, and eventually it's no longer able to support life. So we die. So impermanence means this constant change that takes place in our body, but also in all physical phenomena, all material things. Yeah, a building, a table, a computer, a phone, food, things in nature. They are constantly changing. This is their reality. And it isn't a question of, well, do I believe that or not? Yeah. But you'd be crazy to deny it. It's just obvious. It's scientific. You can see it for yourself if you look carefully at things. So impermanence, Buddha said, really important to contemplate that, to contemplate the impermanent nature of things, and in particular our own body and our life. We really need to become aware of that we are changing all the time, going in the direction of death. We're going to die one day. So they say there's two levels of impermanence. There's gross or coarse impermanence and subtle impermanence. So coarse impermanence is obvious impermanence, like when somebody dies or a building is destroyed or burned down, or car gets smashed up. So when something really comes to an end in an obvious way. So that's coarse impermanence. And then subtle impermanence is the changes that are happening every moment, every tiny fraction of time. Yeah. And it's because of that constant change that's happening in things, that eventually they meet with their end. Like a person dies, a building becomes completely, what's the word, like falls down, falls apart. So when a phenomenon goes out of existence, it dies or is destroyed or whatever. So this is just like the truth, the reality of things, but something we don't always notice or we don't always think about. But it's really important to think about it. So we do that, we meditate on that, and then the second point is the sufferings of the three unfortunate realms. So this is a little more challenging because the three unfortunate realms are animals, hungry ghosts, and hell. So we can see animals. That includes, not just mammals, but birds and insects and fish and so on. So all those kind of creatures. So we can't deny the existence of those. We live with them. We share our world with them. The other two are harder to accept because most of us aren't able to see them. But they are the hungry ghost realm. These are beings kind of like ghosts or spirits. And they're really miserable because they're hungry and they're unable to find food to eat. They're thirsty and they're not able to find anything to drink. So they live this long life continuously hungry and thirsty and seeking food and drink, unable to find it. And so it's really a miserable, unfortunate situation. And then there's hell, which is the worst place. That's where you have the worst kinds of suffering. And most religions also have belief in hell. So you've probably heard about that before if you brought up in Christianity. For me personally, this is one of the difficulties I had when it came to Buddhism. Having left behind Christianity and said, I can't follow that, I can't believe that. And coming to Buddhism, and so many of the ideas in Buddhism were, yes, I like that. But then there was hell, and I thought, oh no, I don't want to hear about that again. I left that behind. So I really struggled with that for quite a while, and I probably many other Westerners as well. But I came around to it because, for one thing, if we just look in our world, we see hell-like experiences. There are people who have hell-like experiences, extreme suffering. Like Gaza, yeah? What's been going on in Gaza for the last couple of years, yeah? For most of the Gazans, that's like a hell-like experience, just being bombed constantly. Well, partly also a hungry ghost experience, unable to find food, hungry and thirsty, unable to find food and clean water to drink. But then, there are also people in the West who have illnesses or injuries that cause them constant pain, unbearable pain, and even medication doesn't relieve their pain. So there are people who live with pain, and that's like a hell-like experience. And in some places, people are put into prison and tortured. Yeah, so torture, human beings torturing other human beings. That's something that's happened from, as long as human beings have been in this world, and it still happens today in many places. So that's a hell-like experience. And yeah, so if we just look at, our world and the experiences that some human beings have, they are like hell experiences. So we can't deny that. We can't deny that such experiences exist. So if they exist here in this world, then maybe they also exist in other places. So thinking in that way helped me open my mind to the existence of hell. Anyway, so the point of this topic is to contemplate that there are places we could go in our next life, situations we could be reborn in, which would be really bad and really to be avoided. And the Buddha definitely taught these. If you read the sutras, right, if you really go through the sutras, the Buddha clearly taught the existence of these other realms. And it wasn't meant to scare us, but rather to warn us of the dangers of bad karma, because that's the cause for such rebirths. If we create negative karma, like killing, torturing, causing harm to others, making others suffer. So if we make others suffer, we are creating the cause to suffer ourselves, to be caused suffering by others. So it's like that's karma. You do something to others, it's going to happen to you. So the Buddha was just trying to warn us, don't behave like that. Don't harm others, because you're going to end up in these bad situations. So that's why he taught karma. So then those first meditations, impermanence and death and the sufferings of the unfortunate realms, is to incite a concern about what happens after we die. And then secondly, there's the solution. There is a solution to this. How to avoid unfortunate rebirths and obtain fortunate ones. So fortunate rebirths would be like us. We're human beings. This is one of the fortunate states of rebirth. And then there's also heaven. They don't usually use the word heaven in Buddhism. They use the term deva realms or God realms. I prefer the term deva. It's a Sanskrit term. And so these are beings who are in even better situations than we are. So they have these sort of celestial, heavenly realms where they have much less suffering than we do and greater happiness and pleasure than we do. And there isn't just one heaven. There's a total of 27 at different levels going up. And these fortunate realms are the result of good karma. So if you create good karma, virtue, then the result is being born in either a human realm or in one of these deva realms. So this second point is how to avoid unfortunate rebirths and obtain fortunate ones. And the way to do that is by first meditating on refuge in the three jewels, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. So this is for those who are able to feel faith, devotion, confidence in the three jewels, the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. So there's that whole topic of refuge. And then the second is karma, how to refrain from non-virtue and create virtue. So there we go in, we learn all the details of what is non-virtue that we should avoid if we don't want a bad situation in our next life, and what is virtue that we want to create as much as we can to have a fortunate rebirth. So these are the main topics covered in the initial level of the Lamrim. And so, when we start learning Buddhism, and I think this is true in all traditions, not just Tibetan Buddhism, but this is one of the first things we need to learn. We need to learn how to live our life in a way that we avoid non-virtue or harmful actions, negative actions, and create virtue, good actions. We could also call this ethics. This is like, living ethically. Buddhist ethics is basically, refraining from harmful actions and doing positive, beneficial actions as much as possible. And we won't have time to, do all of these meditations. There's quite a few different meditations in this section, but I thought this morning, kind of running out of time. Well, I guess we have a little bit of time left. Maybe we could do a short meditation on impermanence, just to get some idea. And then after the break, there's another period of meditation, so we could do another Lamrim meditation then. If you're feeling cramped, we've already been sitting now for more than an hour, and you'd like to stand up and stretch, please do so you can be comfortable during the meditation. So begin by checking your position, sitting position for meditation. Whether you're sitting on the floor, you're sitting in a chair, try to keep your back straight. That helps the mind to be more clear and awake. It's also important to be relaxed, so try not to tense any part of your body, like your shoulders. Let your shoulders drop and be relaxed. And it's a good idea to keep your eyes open a little bit, looking down. That helps to stay awake. If you close your eyes, you can become sleepy. I do want to stay awake when we meditate. Let your breathing flow in and out in a natural way. So we can start to become more aware of impermanence just by observing our breathing and aware that each breath is new and different. We're breathing in different air than the last breath. And the air we breathe out is also different than the air we breathe in. It's changed. The molecules have changed. And there are also different things happening in our body with each breath, with each inhalation and each exhalation. Different experiences happening in the body. So see if you can just start to notice that. How the body is changing from one breath to the next. And even within one breath. As you breathe in and as you breathe out. Let your awareness expand from your breathing to the rest of your body. I feel your whole body sitting where you are. And see if you can have the awareness, or at least the understanding, that your body, your whole body, is changing every moment. We can't perceive this with our eyes or feel it with our tactile sensation, but we can know it just by our knowledge of how the body is made up of many parts. They are in turn made of smaller parts like cells, molecules, atoms, subatomic particles. And at that subtle level, there's change happening all the time. Molecules and atoms are moving around. Cells are reproducing, dying, moving, performing their functions. I just have this awareness that at the subtle level of your body, there's constant change taking place. Your body is never exactly the same from one moment to the next. And the same is true for the bodies of everyone else. All the other people sitting around us in this room, and all the other people out there in the world, and animals. So all living beings who have bodies like us, physical bodies, their bodies are also changing every moment, every tiny fraction of time. And the same is true for all physical, material things. That includes all the things in nature, like trees and plants, and hills and mountains, bodies of water, the earth itself. So all those things are also made of particles, like molecules, atoms, subatomic particles, and those are constantly changing, never the same from one moment to the next. And likewise with the things made by us, human beings, like buildings and houses, cars, computers, and all the manufactured things, all the products made by people. So these are also made of particles that are changing all the time, never the same from one moment to the next. So ask yourself if our bodies and all the things in the world around us are changing all the time, getting older, closer to death or destruction. Does it make sense to have attachment, clinging to any of these things, wanting them to always remain the same and always be there forever? Okay, so just a brief glimpse of impermanence, and that's what we were meditating on is subtle impermanence. normally in the Lamrim we're asked to meditate on coarse impermanence in terms of like our own death, the fact that we're going to die and everyone else dies. But I personally find it really helpful to contemplate subtle impermanence, this changing nature of things. Really does help you to see things in a different way. So we have a break now for half an hour, and see if you can continue to have this awareness, this mindfulness of impermanence, just to whatever degree you're able to. It doesn't mean like every moment, but just to continue contemplating impermanence as you get up and move and walk out of here, and then get a cup of tea or coffee or whatever. We're still in silence until after lunch, so keep the silence. And it's also nice to observe impermanence in the world around us. So like now it's very clear that we're coming into autumn. Lots of leaves are falling off the trees, and trees are becoming bare, well, some of them anyway, and wind is blowing them around. So just by observing those things, that helps us to be more aware of impermanence. So it's actually happening all the time, but often we're not paying attention to it, not aware of it. So just do the best you can to maintain that kind of mindfulness or awareness of impermanence during the break. And then we'll meet again at 11:30.